group of people. Let me just say first, if I could, today in Venezuela there have been long-made plans for demonstrations by the opposition against the Maduro regime and the Cubans and Russians that control it. We expect the government to respect the rights of private citizens in Venezuela. We don't want to see a repeat of the violence of yesterday. We hope the people are not intimidated by the violence used against them, and we look forward to seeing how these demonstrations go. I'll take a few questions.
Ambassador Bolton, can you characterize what type of pressure the president is prepared to put on both Cuba and Russia? We saw his tweet, but can you give us a few more details?
Well, I think the president's been very clear that he thinks that the foreign military presence in Venezuela needs to leave. He referred to the Russians and said that they should be out of Venezuela when First Lady, wife of Juan Guaido, was here some weeks back. His tweet yesterday was a very strong warning to the Cubans about the consequences if they engaged in any violence against the Constitution in Venezuela. And I think the key point here is that if this afternoon 20 to 25,000 Cubans left Venezuela, I think Maduro would fall by midnight. It's this foreign presence that sits on top of the military, sits on top of the government, that makes it impossible for the people's voice to be heard. So it's not something that we sought, but we've made it very clear that the Monroe Doctrine is alive in this administration. We expect these foreign influences to depart.
Mr. Ambassador, can you explain how
sanctions against Russia and Cuba?
There could be a lot of steps. We're going to have a quickly called meeting of National Security Council principals today at 2 o'clock. We'll be considering a lot of steps.
Can you explain how a complete embargo of Cuba would work, because the embargo is made up in part of laws that have been passed by Congress? So how would a complete embargo, sort of a snapback, work at the presidential level?
Well, I don't want to get into the specifics, but remember, the president has constitutional authority under Article 2, Section 1, the first sentence of the Constitution, which, as you all know, says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. He's also the commander-in-chief. But we've been in consultation with Congress. I might say this is an issue, despite the partisan wrangling in Washington over so many things. There's been very broad bipartisan support for our position. I spoke yesterday with Speaker Pelosi, with Senator Schumer, with many of their colleagues, Republican and Democrat, and it's very heartening, and I think important for foreign governments in particular. They know the partisanship in Washington on this issue of a peaceful transfer of power in Venezuela. We are as united as on any issue I can remember in a long time.
How confident are you that Maduro is not going to be in power soon?
I'm very confident, and I'll tell you why. I think it's not appreciated fully that the effect of our economic sanctions have a cumulative effect. In other words, we announce sanctions against PDVSA, let's say, the state-owned oil monopoly, and a few days go by and people say, well, Maduro's still in power, I guess the sanctions aren't having an effect. But every day that goes by, Venezuela sells less oil internationally, it gets less revenue, its ability to finance the basic operations of government declines. So the cumulative effect of those and other sanctions we've put on are bringing the Maduro government to the point where it won't be able to pay the service members, it won't be able to buy equipment for their vehicles, it won't be able to refine gasoline. A whole range of its abilities to function will diminish. And as those pressures build, it puts, I think, more pressure on his top supporters. And yesterday, even though Maduro didn't leave the country as he was planning to do because of Russian advice, the fact is key figures like the defense minister, the chief judge of the Supreme Court, the head of the Presidential Guard have been outed as people dealing with the opposition. And someday the documents that they were prepared to sign with the opposition will become public. So if you're Nicolas Maduro, can you look at your defense minister anymore and trust him? I don't think so. I think Maduro is now surrounded by scorpions in a bottle, and it's only a matter of time.
What did the Russians,
We'll try over here, okay?
That's essentially my question. What is it that the Russians said to get Maduro to say, what do you mean by advice? Did they make him any promises?
Well, the Russians haven't vouchsafed us their entire conversation with Maduro, but I think it was instructive that although Juan Guaido was out in public all day yesterday in the streets of Caracas, Maduro didn't appear until the end of the day. Why? Because he was at Fort Tiuna in Caracas. It has a number of facilities and military prisons, but among other things, it's one of the key Cuban command posts in Venezuela. So Maduro spent the day not in the company of Venezuelan forces, but surrounded by Cubans because he doubted the loyalty of the Venezuelan armed forces. Let me try somebody else.
Talk a little bit about China and the Chinese involvement, and if China is willing to cooperate with the U.S. at all on this.
Well, in some sense, China and Russia are in a similar position. Russia is more involved, but both countries have billions of dollars of debt at stake here in Venezuela, and I think they should be very cautious about how they proceed, because if they simply assume Maduro's going to prevail and that turns out to be wrong, they could see substantial financial losses. Now, we've heard reports, you've seen them in the press, that Chinese computer techniques were used to try and shut down social media in Venezuela yesterday. We're looking at a wide range of things. I wish I could talk about them because I think the American people would be proud of our capabilities. I can't do that. But we're looking at a wide range of things we could do to counter some of this kind of support for Maduro. Yes, sir.
Has the U.S. made any promises or created any assurances for Maduro in the event he leaves the country? If so, what might they be?
Well, first step is that the National Assembly has passed a very wide-ranging amnesty law. They're considering additional amnesty provisions. They'd like to persuade people to come over from the regime. We have said we will provide off-ramps from the sanctions we've imposed if, in fact, people come over. But it depends on their conduct, and that's what I think we have to look at. We'll have to examine each one individually. Obviously, the sooner they come over to the opposition, the better.
One more
Ambassador,
about
sorry, I know you're here to talk about Venezuela, but there are reports.
Which is what I will talk
there are
about.
reports coming out this morning that the president is planning to visit Turkey in July. Is a presidential visit something that we would want to reward Turkey with, considering they're not backing down from buying the Russian S-400s?
Yeah, as I said, I'd rather stick to Venezuela. I'll take one more question. Yes, lady over here.
The state is going to reach out to his counter.
Sorry. Maduro is denying that he was about to board the plane to go to Cuba, and I'm just wondering what evidence you have that this was actually about to happen.
Well, this is one of those situations where I really can't tell you the specifics of it, but what Mike Pompeo said yesterday, I think we have very, very high confidence was accurate. I think it reflects the role Russia has in Venezuela. I don't say this is an ideological conflict, but this is our hemisphere. It's not where the Russians ought to be interfering. This is a mistake on their part. It's not going to lead to an improvement of relations. And in particular, it emphasizes that without this foreign involvement, you know, people yesterday were on some networks I won't mention, were calling what Guaido was trying to do a coup. It's not a coup when the legitimate president gives orders to his government. What is a coup is the presence of Cuba and Russia directing the top affairs of the government of Venezuela. Thank you very much.
Is the president going to call President Putin, Ambassador Bolton?
Is a legal investigation into this president a coup, Ambassador?